Did you know that in a certain year, in a powerful city, one night created a secret that changed several lives? It began in the heart of a relentless metropolis, a place where the skyscrapers pierced the clouds like silver needles, and the rain always tasted of cold iron and expensive perfume. On that particular evening, the city was celebrating the winter solstice with a masked gala held at the Thorn Estate, a fortress of glass and marble perched high above the common world. Julian Thorn, a man whose name was synonymous with industry and ice, moved through the crowd like a predator in a tailored suit. He was a man who owned everything but felt nothing, his eyes scanning the masquerade for a flicker of something real, yet finding only the polished facades of the elite. Then, there was Alara. She was not supposed to be there. She was a cellist for the evening's orchestra, a woman whose life was measured in sheet music and the soft hum of the subway. But in the chaos of a sudden, citywide power failure that plunged the Thorn Estate into a velvet darkness, their paths collided. In the absence of light, titles and bank accounts vanished. There was only the scent of rain clinging to her skin and the frantic, rhythmic drumming of his heart against his ribs. They spoke in whispers that night, huddled in a corner of the darkened library while the storm raged outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. He didn't see her face clearly, only the curve of a jawline and the liquid starlight in her eyes, and she knew him only as a voice that sounded like gravel and silk. It was a connection born of desperation and the strange, haunting intimacy that only total darkness can provide. They shared a bottle of vintage wine and a lifetime of unspoken regrets. When the heat between them finally ignited, it was not a transaction of power, but a collision of two lonely souls seeking warmth in a frozen world. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, Alara awoke to the sight of the city stirring below. The reality of her intrusion into this world of predatory wealth crashed down upon her. She looked at the man sleeping beside her, his features softened by exhaustion, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man haunted by ghosts. Panicked by the sheer scale of the Thorn name embossed on the stationery by the bed, she gathered her clothes in a frantic silence. She fled before the sun could fully reveal her identity, leaving behind nothing but the fading scent of jasmine and the echo of a heartbeat. Weeks later, in a cramped apartment where the heating hissed and the walls were thin, Alara looked down at a plastic stick with two trembling lines. The world she knew felt like it was tilting on its axis. She searched the newspapers, seeing Julian Thorn's face on every financial cover. A man who had survived a car accident the very morning she left, an accident that the tabloids claimed had left him with a fragmented memory of that gala night. To the world, he was a king reclaiming his throne. To her, he was a shadow she could never hope to touch. For 5 years, she raised the boy alone. She named him Leo, and as he grew, his eyes became two piercing shards of silver gray, the exact same eyes that had watched her in the dark of the Thorn Library. She worked 3 jobs, hid from the society pages, and taught Leo that their small world was enough. She thought she was safe. She thought the secret was buried under the weight of time and the indifference of a powerful man who couldn't even remember the curve of her smile. But destiny has a way of pulling at the loose threads of a lie. For 5 years, Julian Thorn had lived in a gilded cage of his own making, haunted by a ghost he could not name. The car accident on the morning of his disappearance from the gala had stolen the finer details of that night. The shape of her nose, the sound of her laughter, leaving behind only a visceral, aching sense of loss. He had hired investigators, men who specialized in finding the unfindable. But how do you find a woman who left no name, no footprint, and whose face was a blur of shadows and moonlight? He walked through his glass-walled penthouse like a man searching for a doorway that had been bricked over, his eyes constantly scanning crowds for a flicker of recognition that never came. The media called him the Iron Bachelor, a man whose heart had supposedly turned to stone along with his memories. They didn't know about the recurring dream he had, the scent of jasmine and the feeling of a small, warm hand resting against his chest in the dark. One afternoon, the relentless machinery of his life brought him to the Metropolitan Botanical Gardens for a charity foundation launch. It was an event of stifling elegance, filled with the clinking of champagne flutes and the artificial smiles of donors. Julian, suffocated by the performative grace of it all, slipped away from his security detail, wandering into the humid sanctuary of the Fern Grotto. He wanted silence. He wanted to breathe air that didn't smell like cold ambition. There, by a shallow stone pool reflecting the green canopy above, he saw a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 5. He was dressed in a small, slightly frayed navy blazer that had seen better days, kneeling by the water's edge. He was intensely focused, carefully launching a boat made from a folded program, a program for the afternoon string quartet performance. Julian stopped, his breath hitching in a way he didn't understand. There was something in the way the boy held his shoulders, a certain stubborn set to his jaw, that felt like looking into a distorted mirror of his own childhood. "The current is too strong over there," Julian found himself saying, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "It'll capsize if it hits the fountain's edge." The boy looked up, and for Julian, the world simply stopped turning. The child didn't have the soft, rounded features of a stranger. He had Julian's own face, rendered in miniature. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in Julian's veins, piercing, liquid silver-gray eyes, framed by long, dark lashes. They were the eyes Julian saw every morning in the mirror, eyes that were a signature of the Thorn bloodline for 3 generations. "I'm testing the structural integrity," the boy said, using words far too old for his voice, his tone possessing a calm, analytical precision that made Julian's heart thud painfully against his ribs. "If it sinks, I'll just build a better one. That's what my mom says. You have to keep building." "Your mother is a wise woman," Julian managed to whisper, kneeling on the damp moss beside the boy. He felt a magnetic pull, a terrifying, inexplicable recognition that hummed in the air between them. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, wanting to touch the boy's dark curls, to confirm this wasn't another fragment of a broken dream. At that moment, the sound of a cello surged from the main hall, a deep, morning vibration that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the garden. A few yards away, hidden behind a curtain of weeping willow branches, Alara stood paralyzed. She had come looking for Leo during her break, her cello still gripped in one hand, her bow in the other. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps as she watched the most powerful man in the city, the man who haunted her nightmares and her most secret longings, kneeling in the dirt beside the son he didn't know he had. She saw Julian's hand reach out. She saw the way his eyes searched Leo's face with a desperate, burgeoning realization. The sunlight filtered through the glass roof, illuminating the two of them, the Titan and the spark, and Alara felt the weight of her 5-year-old lie beginning to crush her. The danger was no longer a shadow. It was standing in the light, and it was only a matter of seconds before Julian Thorne turned his gaze toward her. The final note of the cello performance hung in the humid air of the conservatory, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to tether Alara to the spot where she stood. "Leo," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound, but it was enough. The boy turned, his face brightening with a pure, uncomplicated joy that sliced through the suffocating tension of the moment. "Mom, look, this man knows about boats," Leo called out, his small hand pointing toward the figure still kneeling in the dirt. Julian Thorne rose slowly, his movements possessed by a sudden, predatory grace. He turned his head, his gaze cutting through the willow branches like a blade. When his eyes finally landed on Alara, the world narrowed until there was nothing left but the two of them and the heavy, oxygen-rich air of the grotto. For Julian, it was as if a flashbulb had gone off in a darkened room. He didn't remember her name, and he didn't remember the details of her life, but his body remembered the way her pulse felt against his own. The scent of jasmine, faint but unmistakable, drifted from her toward him, and the fragmented puzzle in his mind began to shudder toward a terrifying completion. "You," he said, the single word carrying the weight of 5 years of silence. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation and a prayer all at once. Alara stepped out from behind the trees, clutching her cello case to her chest like a shield. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. She saw the way Julian looked at her, the confusion warring with a burgeoning, fierce possessiveness, and then she saw his gaze flicker back down to Leo. The resemblance was no longer just a coincidence. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the afternoon, the truth was written in the shape of the boy's brow and the defiant tilt of his head. "We have to go, Leo," Alara said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. She didn't look at Julian. She couldn't. If she met his eyes for too long, she feared she would dissolve into the very air. She reached for Leo's hand, her fingers cold. "Wait," Julian commanded. It was the voice of a man used to stopping the pulse of global markets with a single phone call. He took a step toward them, his shadow falling over Alara, tall and imposing. "I know those eyes. I know that child." "You don't know us," Alara lied, the words tasting like ash. "You're mistaken, Mr. Thorne. We were just leaving." But the exit was no longer clear. The sounds of heavy footsteps and the crackle of radio static signaled the arrival of Julian's security detail, who had finally tracked their principal to the grotto. Men in dark suits and earpieces filtered into the greenery, their presence a cold intrusion of power into a private moment. Beyond them, at the edge of the gardens, the flash of a long-lens camera glinted, a paparazzo who had caught scent of the billionaire's unusual behavior. The pressure of the world began to close in, the media's hunger for a Thorne scandal humming just out of sight. Julian ignored his men. He stepped closer, until he was close enough to see the terror in Alara's eyes and the fierce, protective way she pulled the boy into her side. 5 years, Julian whispered, his voice low so only she could hear. "I spent 5 years wondering if I had dreamed you. And all this time, you were raising a thorn in the shadows." "He isn't a thorn," Alara hissed, her fear finally turning into a desperate kind of courage. "He's mine. He's just a boy who likes boats and music. He has nothing to do with your world of glass and steel." Julian reached out, not for her, but toward Leo, his fingers hovering just inches from the boy's cheek. The boy didn't flinch. He looked at Julian with a curious, searching expression, as if he recognized a melody he had heard in the womb. "He has everything to do with me," Julian said, his eyes finally locking onto Alara's with a terrifying intensity. "And I don't let go of what belongs to me." The flash of the cameras became more frequent now, the vultures of the press sensing a story that would break the city. Alara realized with a sickening jolt that by finding her, Julian had not just discovered a son, he had painted a target on their backs. The air in the conservatory grew heavy, not with the moisture of the plants, but with the suffocating weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Outside the glass walls, the world had begun to scream. The distant shouting of reporters and the rhythmic, aggressive strobing of camera flashes turned the lush greenery into a flickering, black and white, silent film. The sanctuary had become a cage. Julian stood at the center of it, a titan realizing that his empire was built on a foundation of hollow air, while the only thing of true value stood trembling before him in a faded blazer. "Tell me," Julian demanded, his voice dropping to a register that was barely more than a vibration, yet it commanded the very molecules of the room to still. He didn't look at the guards forming a perimeter. He didn't look at the frantic movements of his PR chief approaching with a tablet. He looked only at Alara. "Look at me and tell me that his heart doesn't beat with the same rhythm as mine. Tell me those eyes are a trick of the light." Alara felt the coldness of the cello's wood against her palm, a grounded reality in a moment that felt like a fever dream. She looked at Leo, who was watching the adults with a growing, quiet anxiety, sensing the tectonic plates of his small life shifting beneath his feet. She saw the way Julian's shadow merged with Leo's on the mossy ground, a silhouette of a legacy she had tried so hard to outrun. "The truth doesn't matter to a man like you, Julian," she said, her voice finally breaking, the tears she had held back for 5 years finally tracing hot, shimmering paths down her cheeks. "To you, truth is something to be bought, sold, or buried. But he isn't a stock option. He isn't a headline. He's a little boy who cries when he drops his ice cream and who thinks the stars are holes in the floor of heaven. If you take him into your world, into that light, you'll burn him alive." "I am not trying to take him," Julian countered, taking a final, decisive step that breached her personal space, bringing with him the scent of expensive cedar and the raw, electric heat of his presence. He reached out, his gloved hand gently tilting her chin upward, forcing her to meet a gaze that was no longer icy, but filled with a terrifying, desperate fire. "I am trying to find the man I was supposed to be. I am trying to remember the night the world went dark and I finally saw something clearly." The chaos outside reached a crescendo as a photographer breached the first line of security, the heavy thud of a body against the glass doors echoing through the grotto. Julian's lead security detail moved in, his voice urgent. "Mr. Thorne, we have to move. The crowd is becoming uncontrollable. We have a secondary exit through the service tunnels, but we need to go now." Julian didn't move. He looked at Alara, a silent plea in his eyes that contradicted the power of his name. He was offering her a choice that wasn't really a choice. Stay and be torn apart by the vultures of the press, or step into the shadow of his protection and risk losing her soul to the Thorne legacy. "They will find out who he is, Alara," Julian whispered, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek with a tenderness that shattered her last defenses. "The moment those photos hit the wire, the world will hunt him. They will look for the Thorne heir until there is nowhere left for you to hide. Let me be the wall between you and them. Just for tonight." Alara looked at the door, where the glass was vibrating under the pressure of the mob, and then at Leo, who had reached out to grab a handful of Julian's expensive coat, seeking stability in the storm. She realized then that the secret wasn't hers to keep anymore. It belonged to the city now, to the cameras, and to the man who couldn't remember her face but recognized his own soul in her child. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against Julian's sleeve, a surrender that felt like a sacrifice. "If I go with you," she breathed, "you have to promise. He stays a child. He stays mine." Julian's expression didn't soften. It hardened into something protective and ancient. "He is a thorn," he said, the words sounding like a vow and a threat all at once. "Nothing in this world will ever hurt him again." As the security team surrounded them, forming a human shield against the blinding lights and the screaming questions, Julian swept Leo into his arms with a natural, practiced ease that he shouldn't have possessed. He placed a hand on the small of Alara's back, guiding her toward the darkness of the tunnel. Behind them, the paradise of the conservatory was left to the wolves, while ahead lay a world of luxury, danger, and a truth that was about to change the history of the Thorne dynasty forever.